Good afternoon, it's Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It's Monday, February the 3rd, 2025, and I'm happy to be able to come in and talk to you a little bit today and kind of catch up on a series that I started some time back. I mentioned, I believe, early on that I used to teach a course in world religions, and I'm always fascinated with the different manifestations of spirituality and religious practice, and have taken a lot of interest recently in how that overlaps with embroidery and stitching, but also all sorts of handcrafts. And there's a certain mindfulness and spiritual practice, I think, that goes along with embroidery and stitching, knitting, those kind of things. So I want to pick back up on the series that I began. If you missed earlier ones, I talked about the Indian subcontinent, Hinduism, and those traditions in episode number 27. In episode 32, I went over some ideas and some thought processes about Far Eastern religions like Taoism and Confucianism. And of course, more recently, I did a section on some specific kind of stitching that's related to Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And in episode 40, I talked some about Judaism. So I want to finish up that series. I'm going to do 3 parts beginning today on Christianity, because that's the area that I'm most well versed in and have a lot of experience in terms of Western culture. And then I'll do a session on Islam to kind of finish up our look at the living world religions, the larger traditions that we know of today. Several people have expressed an interest in these. I realize that not everybody is part of an organized tradition, but the overlap between that and the handmade objects is what fascinates me so much. Just to give you a little bit of a context, as I mentioned, I've already talked about Judaism. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all very much related. They're all kind of kissing cousins, if you will. They all descend from the heritage and the culture of Abraham, Father Abraham. Judaism, of course, began in the Middle East. Christianity started out as converted Jews and then reached out beyond that tradition into other parts of the Gentile world. And Islam traces its roots to the Abrahamic tradition as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I look at Islam. I think it's sometimes kind of ironic to notice that the 3 traditions that are most closely related when we look across the world are ones that often have great conflict. Maybe that's kind of similar to what happens in families sometimes, where siblings or family members have some of the greatest disagreements. And it certainly is painful to think about the sadness and the sorrow that's been present in the Middle East, and the history of violence and terrible things that have happened between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But I don't want to get too far into that. My thought today was just to talk a little bit about kind of the interrelationship of the rise of Christianity and handmade objects. I focus specifically, and we'll talk a little bit today, about how embroidery and church vestments and liturgical worn objects are part of the tradition, but they're so intertwined with things like painted manuscripts and development of artistic versions of the Bible, which would be both painted and written using the Latin language. They're interrelated with woodwork and carving. At the beginning of today's piece, I've given you a couple pictures, just a quick little glance. The first 4, I believe, are versions of the gospel as they were created in Ireland for the most part. The Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, the Book of Duro. Those are some illuminated manuscripts that were done in monasteries in Ireland and the United Kingdom. And then after that, you see a couple of examples of very early embroidery work, and you'll see that they're very similar. The paintings, the wood carvings, stained glass, all of those are very much interrelated in terms of what they look like, what the motifs are, and stitching has followed along in that tradition. Some instances, stitching began certain patterns or ideas, and then other times they borrowed it from manuscript Bibles or from stained glass windows. So we know that Christianity got its origins out of the rise of Jews who converted to Christianity, who believed in the Godhead figure of Jesus Christ. For the first few centuries of Christianity, it was very much a minority religion in Rome, very much oppressed, and we've probably heard stories about martyrdoms and the violence against the early Christians. It wasn't until Constantine, the Roman emperor, converted to Christianity that it was actually safe to be a Christian. So what you find in those first 3-4 centuries of Christianity in terms of what we're talking about, embroidery and liturgical garb, is that there really wasn't much of it. One of the things you did as a Christian in those days is you probably did not proclaim very loudly, unless it was a test of faith, that you were a Christian. And even the Christian leaders in those early centuries really just wore pretty much regular garments as anybody else in a leadership position in Rome might have worn. Beginning about the 4th century and certainly building into all the way up through probably 10, 11, 12th centuries, you began to see the church gain some power and some influence. It was the Church of Rome at that point, but it also spread, and there was the Eastern tradition in Constantinople. And you began to see church leaders starting to wear clothes that set them apart from everybody else. Long flowing robes, chasubles and stoles and things like that. Now, they weren't just finery. There was a lot of intention in doing that. Obviously, you wanted the person who was in charge to look like a leader and to kind of be set apart. But also, if you think about it, if there were large gatherings and if there were large buildings like cathedrals, it would have been hard to see the leader unless they were wearing something distinctive. I also mentioned in an earlier episode that most of the people who would have attended a cathedral church or any sort of worship experience in the first 1,000 years would have been illiterate. And so symbols and things like that would have been important. And if there was a priest on an altar way up somewhere, you needed bright colors, you needed distinctive symbols that you could recognize, things like the cross or the large letters of the Latin alphabet that might spell the name of Jesus or something like that. So as the Roman Church begins to build after Constantine, you do see an increase in the richness of clergy robes and in the things that were used to decorate the church, the altar cloths, things that might have been used on the stand where the gospel was read and the pulpit and things like that. There's a huge amount of research done on these, and unfortunately a lot of them did not survive, of course, because they were made with fibers and threads and fabric. But there are a lot of designs and a lot of images that have survived from those periods. As I say, they would have needed to be very large and very bold. But something that I've not thought about a lot was how very, very important that was in building the power and the influence of the Christian church in the West. It may have been little old ladies somewhere doing all this stitching, or perhaps men for that matter as well. And today, maybe we don't think too much about the importance of embroidery in the building of the stature of the church. But, the Roman Catholic Church is still one of the largest landowners in the world. The power and influence of Christianity, not just in the West, but worldwide, is tremendous. And some of the building of that came from the traditional handcrafts that we talk about today in terms of embroidery, along with stonemasons and woodcutters and stained glass window creators and all those sort of things. Now I'm going to talk about Christianity in three parts, so I'm basically going to stop around the year 1100, 1200 today, and then I'll get to the Middle Ages and the Reformation next time, and in the last episode I'll talk some about the modern Christian church and the embroidery that we see present there, and I can talk a lot about that because that's something I have a lot of experience in. At the same time as we're talking about the rise of the Roman Church, and in the centuries that followed the 4th century when Constantine converted to Christianity, you see the rise of monasteries and convents all over Western Europe. Sometimes we refer to the period before and after 1000 AD as the Dark Ages. And we think about that as a time when there wasn't a flourishing of artistic expression, when there were the awful plagues that killed so much of the population of Western Europe and all those sort of things. And calling it the Dark Ages suggests that there wasn't much happening. And perhaps there was a suppression of some of what we would call today artistic expression. But the monasteries and the convents, since they were secluded from the world, since they might have been even protected from some of the diseases and some of the other things like the Black Plague that wiped out huge parts of the population, continued these wonderful handcrafts. And that's why at the beginning of the video today, I gave you some pictures of those illuminated gospels that monks would have worked on in the monasteries and would have kept there as basically relics or sacred representations of the Gospels. If you've ever been to Dublin and gone to Trinity College and seen the Book of Kells, it's just amazing what was done there with pen and ink and colored work and gold foil and all the kind of things that were used to create those beautiful Gospels. But every time I look at them, I also see embroidery stitches, and I see the interplay between what they were doing with those and the embroidery that we see today. I think it's Opus Angelicum. If you go on to Instagram, there's a wonderful page there that helps you to kind of bridge what we do today in terms of embroidery with some of those wonderful traditions of the past. Now, the great flowering of that is going to come in the next episode when we talk about the Renaissance and just a kind of a whole flourishing of artistic expression. But I guess my point here today is that the work of Christianity during what we often refer to as the Dark Ages helped to carry that artistic expression through a very dark time in human history. And I guess probably what I would argue is that anytime there have been those lulls in artistic expression on a large scale in terms of civilizations, those of us who do handcrafts and those of us who stitch and do woodcraft and all those sorts of things carry that tradition forward because we do it at the local level. It's men and women in their homes and in little workshops and places like that, monasteries and convents, as I talked about in the Middle Ages, who carry those traditions forward. That's why this handmade object discussion is so vitally important, because it is a way to carry our culture forward. I was thinking back to that TED Talk I did several years ago too, and it really boils down to a very simple formula. Number one, find the objects that were handmade that have come to you as a part of your heritage, and make sure you try to understand the stories of those. And then as you find a handcraft or a stitching technique or something that allows you to be creative, make sure you embrace that and carry that tradition forward and create those objects and stories for the generations that come after us. I really think there's there's a great purpose for that, even in our in the disruption and the political upheaval of our modern day. In those early manuscripts and in the early liturgical work, ware and the stitching that was done, they were largely crosses and geometric figures. You began to see some rudimentary figures of humans and animals and things like that as you move through that period. As we get to the 13th century, which is just about where we're going to start talking about the Renaissance next week, or in a future episode, I'm not sure it'll be next week, you start the development of liturgical colors as well. So if you were in church on Pentecost Sunday in the 9th century, you would have seen an explosion of red. And if you were there during Passion or the time surrounding Easter, you would have seen rich purple colors. And those liturgical colors have carried forward. If you go to a modern mainline church today and you go in the middle of the summer, you'll see green because that's the color of Kingdom Tide. And we've continued those traditions, sometimes on a much more muted scale, but we still have those. And those go back to the 12th and 13th centuries. And as I said, the other thing I think you notice as you begin to look at early stitching is how it intertwines with stained glass and woodcraft and ivory carving and every other way that the church would have been embellished during those times. Well, that's an introduction to the broad subject of Christianity and some of the artistic output and embroidery that goes along with that. In coming weeks, I'll spend a couple more episodes talking about that and finish that out. At this point, I think that's going to finish me up for today. I hope you're moving along through February and starting to think about maybe a little bit warmer temperatures coming in the spring. As always, this is Gary Sly, and it's the legacy of handmade objects.